We've all been there before, enveloped in some piece of intriguing fiction, hanging on to every word uttered by archetypal heroes and villains, signing off on a contract to have our emotions willily manipulated at every new twist, turn, and tragedy of the narrative, projecting yourself onto the characters as they succeed in identifying with your situation, your disposition, and your troubles, and suspending our disbelief to the moon and back because all that matters in this very moment is the journey and conclusion of an instant classic story. However, every so often, the audience discovers something they're not supposed to, something that's went over the heads of writers, editors, and producers, yet we pick up on it almost instantly. Perhaps a plot hole, or a movie mistake, or an atypical action that assassinates an otherwise solid character. No matter how big or small these are, it reminds us that the world we're engulfed in isn't real, and leaves us with a bad taste in our mouths coming off of it. Now, when it comes to games, breaking immersion is much easier. Of course, we've come a long way in terms of narrative integrity within video games. As technology has gotten more complex, the industry has disconnected from the days of unconditionally putting gameplay ahead of everything else. And yet, even games aren't safe from these long-loathed plot pitfalls. In fact, some would argue that they're more vulnerable to breaking immersion with the consumer more so than films or books. A potent example of this disconnect has only came to light over the past decade. Its discovery has led many to discard once revered narrative-driven games and brings to question the stability of narrative theory within the billion-dollar industry. Its presence so subtle that many miss it. This is narrative dissonance. So what is narrative dissonance? Well, it's something we've all experienced, whether we recognize it or not.
You want to save your brother, right?
I've never shot anyone before.
Or as it's known in industry terminology, ludo-narrative dissonance, coming from the compound of ludology and narrative. This anomaly occurs when the designers of the game struggle to find balance between story and gameplay. A simple definition would be when the cutscenes of the game contradict the gameplay. It wouldn't be hyperbole to say that there are thousands of examples of this. Why do so many first-person shooter protagonists become silver-tongued orators in cutscenes, yet say next to nothing during gameplay? How can the hero brush off being riddled in gunfire for large portions of the game, yet get incapacitated by a single bullet during a cutscene? These contradictions exist with no sign of slowing down in the 8th generation of gaming, and I was surprised that the issue is so unspoken of. However, upon starting my research, I found the issue is known around the industry, and more surprisingly, the phrase is decisively condemned amongst journalists and lampooned amongst developers.
Of course, it's also a very clever sounding word, isn't it? And that means it's easily abused by people who don't want to own their distaste of a particular thing and would rather mask their preferences in pseudo-intellectual warbling.
Even if it started out in conjunction with thematic critique and gaming narrative, within a decade the criticism became petty and pedantic, with many valid community forum discussion ending with "it's a game, get over it, go outside" or something. So it's kind of ironic that I'm making this video. So the issue isn't whether or not narrative dissonance exists, it's whether or not it matters. The primary argument against its importance is that games exist on another plane of conventional storytelling from literature and motion pictures, and having your immersion broken from a gameplay contradiction during a game is like having your immersion broken by song outbreaks in musicals. And that in order to get lost in the world, gaming audiences need a higher threshold on their suspension of disbelief. However, at least all musicals are consistent with their immersion format. Most of the time it's dialogue, song, and repeat. Games on the other hand have a lot more narrative variables depending on their genre, with point-and-click games, strategy games, text adventures, all taking a different approach to storytelling. Even some of the best written games out there actually take advantage of ludonarrative dissonance in order to enhance their story, such as Metal Gear Solid, where a mind-reading enemy can read the player's data saved on the PlayStation's memory card.
I see that you enjoy Konami games.
Or Batman Arkham Asylum, where Scarecrow's fear gas can provoke even the player's greatest fear.
Did anyone catch the game last night?
And to be fair, the majority of ludonarrative dissonance oversights can be found in the popcorn flick equivalent of gaming titles, where it's mostly meant to be a fun gameplay experience that, with all due respect, doesn't take their stories too seriously. But what about when a narrative is taken seriously? When the developers try to compete on the same level as esteemed authors and writers, and assign themselves the onus of going beyond the expectations and conventions of the average game narrative, are we justified in being more critical of them? For these reasons, fans and journalists within the industry have sought solutions to the issue. Freelance writer Brett Makedonsky discovered one in his article with Destructoid, that the solution for developers is to make games that give the player little to no control over any in-game decisions. This will eliminate the possibility of the player diverging from the exact path the developer intended. Perhaps this is a reason for the rise of walking simulators and interactive dramas as of recently. The more important and convoluted a story becomes to a game, the less interactive the developers design it to be. Thus the player has little chance to poison the narrative by intentionally delaying the pacing of the story. But even then, these are vulnerable to the criticism that for stripping down the gameplay so much, they have forfeited their right to be known as interactive media, despite some of their narratives being hailed as the best in gaming history. Regardless of opinion, perhaps the most valuable takeaway coming from the whole discussion is that it has introduced the industry to scholarly debate on the level of film and novel analysis for the first time. Industry veteran Clint Hawking, who originally coined the term in his 2007 blog post, agrees that there is a distinct lack of games criticism as distinct from game reviews, and 10 years later, he's still right. In an era where the most complicated and well-rounded examples of story and character development in games are being relegated to clickbaity articles and pandering reviews for praise, perhaps fans of the medium have a right to expand their lexicon if they want game narratives to be respected. Video games are an art form, and it's only appropriate that they be criticised as such. And with that comes the risk of pretentiousness, misused terms, and ceaseless struggles to find a definitive solution to issues such as ludonarrative dissonance. But in the long run, if discussions such as these promote the idea of insight and scrutiny beyond the mainstream critical game analysis, perhaps a dissonant argument or two is what's best for the industry.